Over millions of years, nature carved and shaped the peaks and valleys of the planet's surface. Like huge hand-hewn sculptures, the mountains of the Earth seem indestructible. Yet there is a fragility here that is often overlooked. When the Earth slips and mountains move, disaster strikes swiftly and often without warning. Valleys below and the lives of those who live there are changed in an instant. November 7th, 1885. In the mountains of British Columbia, a single railway spike is hammered home. For the first time, Canada is truly one nation, linked from sea to sea by ribbons of steel. With the driving of the last spike, Canada's railway builders fulfill a promise made to British Columbia in 1871.
And at that time, British Columbia was only going to enter Confederation if a railway was completed right from coast to coast. So the construction proceeded. It started in the west and it started in the east and slowly inched its way across the continent to meet basically near the Selkirk Mountains.
Over 3,700 meters high, the Selkirks stand as the last great barrier to the Canadian Pacific Railway's push to the west coast. There is an alternative route around the mountains, but it will mean nearly 130 kilometers of additional track. The CPR sends surveyor Albert Rogers for one more crack at the Selkirks. In 1881, Rogers finds what he is looking for and gives the pass his name.
And if you've visited Banff and Jasper, you see these wide, broad valleys with the mountains standing up on each side. But when you go through Rogers Pass, it's very narrow. You almost feel like you can reach out and touch the mountainsides as you drive through. They're huge and steep, and there are walls everywhere.
Railway construction through the Rogers Pass was some of the most difficult construction. The terrain was a big part of it, the steep hills and the deep valleys and the snowfall. Rogers Pass receives an average of 35 to 50 feet of snow in a winter, and of course this impeded their efforts to build.
The accumulating snow in the pass leads to an even greater problem, one with often disastrous results.
If it thawed and froze and had rain on top of that, that would create a lot more hazard, and the men were aware of this. They worked in fear of avalanches.
At the turn of the century, they had no avalanche control as such. They had to keep this main line open, and to do that, they built snow sheds. That was their only defense against avalanches, was to build snow sheds.
If an avalanche comes down over top of it, it would just slide right over top and not interrupt train flow.
The longest snow shed is number 17 at the base of Mount Cheops on the right and Mount Avalanche on the left. The area is further protected by heavy forest on the lower slopes of Mount Avalanche. Throughout the pass, snow clearing is a constant battle. The Rotary snow plow makes the job easier, but does nothing to lessen the risk.
Right from the very first week of construction in Rogers Pass, when 2 men were killed, right through the whole history of the railway presence in Rogers Pass, avalanches were frequent and deaths were frequent.
February 1910. Winter has been especially severe in the Selkirk Mountains. It snows for 10 days, dropping 3.5 meters of snow on the 8-kilometer stretch of Rogers Pass. By the end of February, storms give way to warmer temperatures, but they only make the pass more volatile.
The weather had warmed up and rain had been falling in the area. And these are, as we know today, definite warning signs of avalanche potential. This is a classic situation for avalanche events to occur.
On March 4th, the CPR's westbound Pacific Express narrowly escapes a devastating fate in Rogers Pass. A blizzard has been raging all day. The engineer spots an avalanche high in the mountains and opens the throttle. He clears the slide by less than 100 meters. While the passenger train waits out the storm at a nearby station, another major slide comes down Mount Cheops near the summit of Rogers Pass, blocking the main line under 6 meters of snow.
It was severe enough that it closed down the track. There was, at that point, apparently a passenger train stranded east of the first slide. And it was just general company policy, whenever there was a slide, to clear it as soon as possible.
The job falls to CPR Roadmaster John Anderson. Winter storms over the past few weeks have been the worst he has ever seen. There has been little sleep for him and his crew as they work to clear the snow-covered track along Rogers Pass.
According to one of his letters, he had like 4 hours sleep each night for the 10 previous nights. And on this particular occasion, he'd been working with his crew all day long, and then another slide came down at the summit of Rogers Pass and buried the track some 20 feet deep. So he called out the crew and off they went to clear this particular slide.
John Anderson arrives at dusk with a clearing crew of 63 men, including his younger brother Charles.
Word was sent to the snowplow crew to come out to the site and start clearing the avalanche. And along the way they picked up laborers from other camps who had been working there or had been wintering in outfit cars along the tracks. Their job was going to be to dig out the rocks and the trees that landed on the tracks along with the snow.
Conductor Richard Buckley is there too. He has just applied for a leave of absence and plans to reconcile with his wife after a 15-year separation. Tonight, he is in charge of the big rotary snowplow.
The rotary plow was powered by a locomotive boiler. It would have had a crew of an engineer and a fireman on it. The boiler powered the big rotary blade at the front, and it rotated, and there would have been a blower where the snow escaped as the plow was cutting through the snow.
Engineer William Phillips is at the helm of the locomotive pushing the plow. Fireman Bill LaChance stokes the furnace.
We went up there and we bucked right into the snow slide, you know. But it was a messy place because it was full of timber. This slide that come down brought timber and everything with it. Everything. It cleaned the hill right off, you know. It must have run for over a mile down the hill.
Lanterns and the plow's huge headlamp light the way as the rotary cuts a trench 6 meters deep. Trees, rocks, and other debris make the process a slow one.
They were having trouble using the rotary plow, which every time it would encounter a tree would break down. So the only option they had was to have a crew of shovelers in the cut, and they could feed snow into the rotary plow, and it could be blown out that way.
The shoveling crew is made up of a mix of men from many parts of Canada, as well as the British Isles, Austria, even Japan. Throughout the long evening, they alternate with the plow, waiting for it to cut through what snow it can, then moving into the deep trench to clear out debris. At 11:30 p.m., John Anderson prepares to leave the site to walk to the watchman's shack 450 meters away.
As a roadmaster, he had to report every couple of hours to let the dispatcher know how soon the tracks would be cleared. And they'd been working so hard that he'd forgotten to phone in his report.
As John Anderson passes the trench, the shoveling crew is going back in. One of them is John's younger brother, Charles. Another is Fritz Wellander, who just came back to work that morning.
He'd just been married just a few days before, and he and his bride had gone on a honeymoon, and he'd come back, and instead of taking an extra day off, he'd gone out to join the crew.
The work site is a din of noise. But outside the trench, bridge carpenter Duncan McCrae hears something else, far away at first, but getting closer.
I heard a crack, the noise of steam from the Rotary. The wildness of the storm made me feel uncertain about it. Then I heard trees cracking above us and knew the worst.
The huge mass of snow and ice races down Mount Avalanche. It bulldozes its way through the heavy forest on the lower slopes, taking the broken timber with it.
Avalanches on average travel in the area of, say, 70 to 100 kilometers an hour. In extreme cases, they've been observed to travel at speeds in excess of 300 kilometers an hour.
I don't think they really heard it coming upon them, so they were really overwhelmed by it.
Must have been just instant. They just never would have had a chance to take a breath.
March 4th, 1910. In Rogers Pass, the CPR crew working to clear an avalanche has no idea of what is raging towards them. Outside the trench, bridge carpenter Duncan McCrae has heard it coming. He tries to run, but the deep snow makes it almost impossible. A blast of wind scoops him up and hurls him into snowshed 17.
The wind blast associated with avalanches is in fact quite rare. However, in very large events, you do get an air turbulence wave ahead of the avalanche, and the destructive power of this air blast is quite significant.
In the cab of the locomotive, fireman Bill LaChance leans in to stoke the furnace. He jumps back when flames suddenly shoot out of the firebox.
Of course, it was only a fraction of a second the snow come in through across the gangway. It hit me, and it picked me up just as this flame come out of the firebox. Pulled me out twice my length, I guess, the way it fell, and then it had just doubled me all up and rolled me like that. Now, trying to keep rolled up in a ball to go with the snow. I don't get one breath because the snow has got packed right tight to my face. And then the pressure come on and things kind of started to stop.
He actually was able to push himself out from the snow and get his head above the snow. He tried to use his feet to push himself up, and then at that point realized that there was something very wrong with one of his legs.
I just touched the toe of that foot to the snow, the right foot, and it just turned and that knee went right plunk down into the snow sideways. And, well, that was that.
So he started to call for help, but didn't really expect anybody to come because he didn't hear anything.
It must have been all happened pretty fast because after I got out, I couldn't hear the engine. The engine should have been blowing a lot of steam, but there was no sound there. Everything was just dead, that's all. Everything was just dead.
In a matter of seconds, the landscape at the summit of Rogers Pass has changed completely. For CPR Roadmaster John Anderson, it's like stepping into an alien world.
He went back to the watchman's cabin to make the call to town, and left behind him there were the lights of the engine, the headlight of the engine, and the headlamps and lanterns of the men working. went and made his call and said, we're moving right along, and then went back and the lights were all gone. No glow from the fireman's box, no headlamp for the Rotary.
I just can't begin to imagine what that would have felt like, to get back there and have the quiet, like no sounds of men's voices, no sound of any kind of work being done, and the darkness, and knowing what had happened.
Anderson finds the 100-ton rotary plow tossed like a toy on top of Snow Shed 17. Smoke and steam rise up through the snow.
And he heard a voice answering very faintly, over here. And so he trudged through the snow with his lantern, and it was up higher than his waist, and he found Bill LaChance.
Bill, I saw him coming up with his lantern and said, what happened? Where is everybody? What happened? And Johnny Anderson says to him, oh, Bill, they're all gone. They're just gone. They're all gone.
There are some survivors. Duncan McCrae emerges from inside Snow Shed 17, where he was thrown by the outer edges of the avalanche. John Anderson finds the camp cook in his overturned kitchen car, shaken but uninjured. Together they move Bill LaChance to safety. Then Anderson calls for help.
As soon as the word was received in Revelstoke, they rang the fire bell, and they rang as many engines as they could at the station, just to alert the town that there was an emergency and to call people out to respond to it.
The whole town knew what was going on, so people would, grab blankets and shovels and went to the station. They always had a train ready with the steam up, just in case.
When rescuers arrive, they are shocked by the scene of utter devastation. More than 150 meters of Snow Shed 17 has been torn away, its heavy timber snapped like matchsticks. But what awaits them under the snow is even worse. The early morning hours of March 5th, 1910. Rescuers from the town of Revelstoke have answered a call for help and arrive at the base of Mount Cheops near the summit of Rogers Pass. They are shocked by the scene of utter devastation. In the light of dawn, they find the locomotive buried on its side under a bank of snow. Pinned beneath it is the broken body of engineer William Phillips. John Anderson makes a discovery of his own.
And he saw a glove sticking out of the snow, and there was a hand inside the glove, and he then cleared away the snow, and it was the conductor, I believe his name was Buckley, and he got him out of the snow, but he was very badly injured. I think he was unconscious at the time, and I think he died an hour or so later.
The trench where the shoveling crew had been working is covered with almost 10 meters of snow. The search for bodies must be done by hand.
Of course, they couldn't use the rotary to clear this. It was all done with shovels. It had to be very slow. At that point, there was no thought of any possibility of survivors.
With the tools they had available at that time, it would have been almost physically impossible to remove somebody from that avalanche deposit in half an hour. That's about what you have available before you suffocate, is around half an hour.
As the bodies are uncovered, it becomes apparent just how quickly the avalanche came down.
Many, many people were found exactly in the spot that they were when the avalanche hit. In other words, they were standing, they had a foot on a shovel.
There was a group of 3 foremen who were standing up when they were dug out of the snow, as if they had just been in the middle of having a chat, and one of them was still holding his pipe. And another fellow was found with his fingers clutched around paper as if he was about to roll a cigarette.
One of the men, Bridge Foreman Dougal MacDonald, is found a few feet from the surface. The story is that he tried to dig himself out.
They said that he was quite a big man and that he was actually trying to sort of push himself up, and he'd managed to come up a couple of feet, but still had a few feet more to dig himself out of, but he just wasn't able to get that further 2 or 3 feet that he needed to.
Over the next few days, 58 bodies are brought to the surface. John Anderson's brother Charles is one of them. So is Fritz Wellander, married only a few days earlier. A coroner's inquest convenes to look into the disastrous Rogers Pass avalanche, which has taken the lives of 58 men. The first jury fails to agree on a verdict. The second takes less than an hour to make its decision.
The second jury agreed that it was purely accidental, it was an act of God. There was no criminal neglect or no liability on the part of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and that their only recommendation was that perhaps crews shouldn't be working during severe storms at night.
For John Anderson, the tragedy is more than he can take. 5 days after the disaster, he resigns.
He gave up a promotion too, I believe. He took a demotion, a lower rate of pay, because he just didn't want to be in that situation again. He had a wife and 3 small daughters, and he wanted to move away from the snow in the mountains, and he was transferred to the ENN in Victoria.
But I think my dad must have been traumatized because he'd lost his young brother. He would feel terrible. He would wonder why he was saved. He liked all the men, and every man would be important to him. It would hurt him terribly.
Despite 2 broken legs and a host of cuts and bruises, Bill LeChance recovers after a long convalescence. He continues to railroad in the mountains for several years.
He had 2 more train wrecks where his train ended up in the river as a result of rock slides, and at that point decided that possibly railroading was not for him, and took a job as a barber, actually, and led a less exciting life after that.
The tragedy in the mountains that night has forever changed the rail line's presence in Rogers Pass.
The number of fatalities was a contributing factor in Canadian Pacific Railway's decision to go underground and build a diversion tunnel through the Rogers Pass, this tunnel being the Connaught Tunnel. It was 5 miles long and went directly under Mount Macdonald and eliminated the need to go up and over the Rogers Pass.
I think basically they just conceded defeat. They tried everything that they could think of, and really the 1910 disaster was just too much, and it was time for the railway just to leave Rogers Pass and abandon that danger forever.
In Rogers Pass, the brutal power of nature's fury strikes quickly, with barely the whisper of a warning. More than 60 years later, in the Italian Alps, she will strike just as swiftly, but this time, her weapon will be water. In northeastern Italy, the rivers and valleys of the Italian Alps have been an important source of water and hydroelectric power for years. One of the largest hydroelectric systems is found in the Vayant Valley, about 100 kilometers north of Venice. Completed in 1960, the Vayant Dam is one of the highest dams of its kind in the world.
Perché la sua capacità era superiore a tutte le dighe.
Its capacity was bigger than the total capacity of all the dams in the Bruno province put together. With 168 million cubic meters of water, it could provide water even during dry spells.
The valley is home to the many villages that line the banks of the Piave River, or hug the base of the steep canyon walls. The largest town is Longarone, the economic hub of the valley. Residents view the dam with mixed feelings.
Le persone lì sapevano che il posto non era adatto per costruire una diga, molti avevano paura.
People knew the place was not right for the dam. The name of the mountain itself, Mount Toc, was for them an ill omen. But the fear in the community was moderated by all the reassurances that came from the experts and the geological surveys that were conducted.
Mount Toc causes builders of the dam the most concern. 6,000 feet high with near vertical cliffs, it is known as the mountain that walks. Studies show that a large area of the mountain is slowly creeping downward, centimeters at a time.
Probabilmente I geologi, ingegneri pensavano
It is
che sarebbe
probable
venuta
that
giù a
geologists
pezzi,
and engineers
piano
thought the
piano,
mountain
un
would
pezzo
come
alla
down
volta,
little
così,
by
anche
little.
se
So even if they
avessero
would lose
perso
part of the basin, the main part
una
of the
parte di
project
bacino,
would be safe.
comunque avrebbero salvato l'intero progetto.
Officials are confident that they can control the movement of the landmass by carefully raising and lowering the water levels in the reservoir. October 1963. It has been raining since late September, and groundwater runoff is hampering attempts to lower reservoir levels. By October 8th, the creep of rock mass down Mount Toc has increased to 40 centimeters a day. The engineer in charge of the dam calls head office for permission to evacuate the area. He is told to stay calm and sleep with his eyes open. In the village of Casso, the mayor orders townspeople off the slopes and posts notices of an anticipated landslide.
Ricordo il pomeriggio perché c'era stato un crescendo di...
I remember the previous afternoon because everyone was getting more and more anxious. They had started moving people from Mount Toc.
In the river valley below, it is business as usual in Longarone.
Però so che Longarone all'epoca era un centro abbastanza.
I know that Longarone at the time was a very lively, busy place. There was a movie theater, some bars. It was the biggest community in the valley, and people from neighboring valleys would converge there.
In 1963, I spent my last summer in Longarone. It was the best summer of my life. We were all young. I was 23. I had my whole life in front of me. And we were happy, even if we didn't have a lot.
October 9th, 1963 was a beautiful, calm fall day. That day, as usual, I went to teach in Igne. I remember in particular that afternoon we took the kids in grade 5 and other grades to a plateau above the town. I still remember that one of my colleagues told me that people were saying there was danger in Longarone.
By 10 o'clock that evening, it is raining again. Throughout the Vayant Valley, many residents have already gone to bed, including Giuseppe Sacchette.
My sister and me were in our beds in the bedroom we shared, and a thin wall separated our room from our parents' bedroom.
In the village of Casso, Gervasia Matsuko watches her mother climb the northern slope of Mount Toc to gather the family's cow herd.
My mother left and I stayed with my grandmother. Grandma was worried. She was walking back and forth. We saw my mother being stopped at the dam. Then 2 men accompanied her to get my grandma's cows.
16-year-old Renato Magotti is at home in Longarone with his parents and brother.
I lived in the center of town. Some of the windows in our home faced the dam, so I looked at it almost every day.
At the dam site, 60 technicians and office staff monitor movement of the mountain. The reservoir is 2/3 full, holding about 135 million cubic meters of water. 10:41 p.m. Suddenly, without warning, giant slabs of rock break away from Mont Toc and begin their slide down the northern slope.
It almost certainly slid as two big coherent blocks, sliding very, very rapidly on a rock surface, so the rock was being exposed behind it.
It takes only 45 seconds for the immense mass of rock to slide down the slope of Mont Toc. It hits the reservoir like a huge stone in a basin of water.
The wave was divided in three parts. The first, and more powerful, went towards Casso and back to the lake. The second went towards Erto and then Canida. The third part went towards Longarone. Almost 50 million cubic meters of water were shot towards Longarone.
I remember a rumble that was getting louder, like that of a waterfall, and huge. A huge noise that filled the valley. A very loud noise to which I associated the collapse of the dam, the feeling that something terrible had happened.
October 9th, 1963. Just after 10:41 p.m., a huge landslide breaks away from Mont Toc in northern Italy's Vayant Valley. A mass of rock weighing 600 million tons plunges into the reservoir with a force that almost empties it. 60 workers at the dam site are killed instantly as waves of water spill out in three directions.
There's one particular town was located directly opposite where the landslide moved and hit the lake, and this town is a town called Casso. Was perched high up on the opposite valley wall, and the airway from the landslide blasted the windows out and took the roofs of most of the houses. But in fact, the wave just missed, so the village wasn't actually hit by the wave.
My grandmother was yelling, telling me to run away, saying it was the end of the world. I instinctively ran uphill, and I don't remember seeing anybody else. I had only one thought in my mind, my mother, and I know now that I knew she was dead that night.
Some of the water generated by the slide pushes upstream towards villages in the reservoir's eastern shore.
Some of the water went towards Erto, and it didn't destroy it, since Erto was protected by a big rock formation. The rock protected Erto, but it redirected the water beyond the lake that was there.
Most of the water finds escape at the other end of the lake, where even the highest dam in the world cannot hold it back.
We think about 30 million cubic meters of water went over the top of the dam. The wave over the top of the dam was about 200 meters above the level of the dam itself, and then crashed down into the valley below.
The huge wave accelerates down the narrow valley towards the town of Longarone. The tide of water, mud, rock, and timber creates a powerful compression of air that travels ahead.
It has been calculated that it got to the end of the valley at 70 kilometers an hour, so it was very fast. The power of the blast that reached Longarone has been compared to 2 Hiroshima bombs.
Il vento ha distrutto le finestre, ha distrutto I tetti delle case,
The wind destroyed roofs and windows, destroyed houses, and killed most of the people because they were caught in the debris. The town was almost destroyed by this wind. The water made the destruction complete.
It was impossible to escape. I was in bed, under the covers. It was so sudden, and Longarone was completely destroyed, even before the water, by the wind. So I was lifted, with the house and everything. Then the water came and took away everything.
I remember ending up under the rubble. on my belly, only my head and part of my chest sticking out. And I raised my head to try and understand what was going on, where I was. And I remember, I couldn't see anything. It was all flat, no houses, nothing.
The flood of water, mud, and debris follows, tearing through Longarone.
It destroyed the whole historical downtown in Longarone, 80% of it. And right there, almost 1,200 people died.
Paolo Munoren is staying at the home of his grandparents on the outskirts of Longarone. He is only 20 months old.
The windows were suddenly blown open by the wind. The water flooded the first floor completely and went up half the height of the second floor. My grandpa took us one by one to the second floor. That's how we survived.
There are other survivors. Although his parents and brother are killed instantly, Renato Magotti is spared.
My friend Renato was thrown about 100 meters from his house, but he was wrapped in his mattress, which protected him.
I remember finding Renato Magotti. We could hear him cry, and we moved the beams that covered him.
The mattress, in a way, saved me from flying objects. In some way, it saved me. It protected my body.
Giuseppe Sacchette and his sister are found half buried in debris 600 meters from what is left of their home in Longarone.
I remember hearing distant voices and seeing small lights, maybe torches. So I cried for help because I couldn't move. And then I know a man was carrying me on his shoulders, up and down the rubble. My parents were never found.
The destruction of Longarone and surrounding villages is hard enough to accept in the darkness of night. In the light of dawn, it is much worse.
C'era un mare di fango ricoperto di centinaia di corpi.
There was a sea of mud covered with hundreds of bodies. I was looking around me, looking for a landmark like the church or the train station, something. There weren't any landmarks anymore. Only the mountains were in place.
Un terremoto, un qualunque cataclisma lasciano comunque.
An earthquake, a natural disaster leaves some traces of a town, but there was only a desert of stones, and the search for survivors was bound to be unsuccessful.
Many of the bodies found buried in mud and debris or tangled in the branches of trees are difficult to identify.
E poi per giorni e giorni sono venuto su in cerca di miei familiari.
For days and days I would come to search for my relatives because it was necessary to find the bodies. The first one I found was my dad. I found him after 3 days, 26 kilometers from Longarone. My mother, I've identified her from pictures, from things she was wearing. Half her head was gone, so she was unrecognizable.
In the cemetery of Fortonia, 766 crosses out of 1,466 don't have a name on them. So more than half of the people were not identified.
Almost 2,000 people died in the Vayant disaster, the majority of them in Longarone. I think more than 1,500 in Longarone, which was pretty much completely destroyed. Only one house was spared, up on the Pirago hill. I was in that house with my grandparents, luckily, and that's why I survived.
Those who do survive do not face the tragedy alone. Neighbors from the surrounding areas assist in the search for survivors. American helicopters help with evacuation.
One of the remarkable things about the disaster was the fact that the dam, in fact, withstood this event. And all that occurred was the top metre or so of the dam was eroded away by the wave. But it's actually an incredible testament to the quality of the engineering that the dam was able to survive the accident.
A government inquiry cites the reservoir as the cause of the slide, but blames bureaucratic inefficiency and the withholding of important information for the terrible magnitude of the tragedy.
There's no doubt that that a certain amount of blame has to be placed upon the engineers who were involved in the project. They designed the dam extremely well, but they didn't understand what was actually occurring in the valley walls.
Questo immenso bacino di acqua è andato a...
That huge water reservoir had changed a geological equilibrium that was created in time. Water not only weighs and exercises pressure, it also infiltrates the soil and gets the base of the mountains wet. Getting wet, the clay soil that constituted the lower part of the mountain under the landslide became slippery and started the sliding movement of the whole landslide into the lake.
Scivolamento di tutta l'immensa frana verso il lago.
Anche se non si sapevano i danni.
Even if it was impossible to foresee the actual damages and gravity of what was to come, they could have evacuated everybody. And this is what gives the people from the area a lot of grief.
Degli abitanti delle zone colpite.
4 years after the disaster, 11 engineers and officials of the Vayant project are brought to trial. The court finds 3 of the men guilty of multiple manslaughter and acquits the rest. Reconstruction of the valley is painfully slow. The village of Erto is rebuilt in a different location, and a similar plan is set for Longarone. When survivors protest, it is rebuilt in its original location, but it can never be the same.
It was not possible to rebuild Longarone because the people were not there anymore. The people who lived in Longarone today are people from neighboring towns who moved to Longarone after the disaster. But the social structure of the previous Longarone was missing. The people were not there. They were dead.
Personalmente devo dire che dentro non sono più come prima.
Personally, I have to say that inside I am not the same person. I am not the way I used to be. When I go to sleep at night, my mind always goes to the memory. Every night, the same thing.
Ogni sera è così.
Disaster can strike at any time, often without warning. It can happen in the blink of an eye, but its legacy can last forever. In Canada, the tragedy of Rogers Pass is a testament to the sacrifice of men who helped tie this country together with ribbons of steel.
Rogers Pass is a National Historic Site today, commemorating the transportation route in the early railroad years. There's a little interpretive sign that's all that marks the place where these 58 men died in the 1910 slide. And people are quite moved by that such a disaster happened here so long ago, and so many people that gave their lives in order to keep transportation moving across Canada was what it came down to.
In Italy, the Vayant Dam is also a tribute of sorts. It still stands, but has not been used as a source of hydroelectric power since the 1963 tragedy. The mass of rock and rubble in the reservoir makes that impossible.
La diga è rimasta là. È un monumento.
So the dam stands there. It's a huge reinforced concrete monument to both human ingenuity that managed to build such a big and strong thing that withstood nature's impact, and human stupidity that defies nature knowing what's in store, thus causing 2,000 deaths.
Quello che poteva andare incontro ha voluto lo stesso sfidare la natura, provocando 2000 morti.
Io ho desiderato tante volte di essere stato a Longarone.
Many times I've wished I had been in Longarone that night.
Di non essermi salvato.
I wished I hadn't survived because what I felt was extremely painful. Pain that lasts. It's not a suffering that fades with time.
Non è una
It
sofferenza
stays with us.
che sia affevolissima nel tempo. Questa per noi rimane.